Hi everyone. Those of us, those of you who are here, and those of you who are online. My name is Imraan Valodia. I'm the Pro Vice Chancellor at Wits University for Climate Sustainability and kind of Inequality, and it's a great pleasure for me to both welcome you all here. And to say a few words about our speaker today. So the Pro Vice Chancellor lecture series is an attempt for us to kind of cross the boundaries in academic work that really kind of keep us in our own spaces. And what we're trying to do in the seminar program is to give a platform to both South African and international speakers who are trying to kind of break some of these boundaries and are trying to do work on climate change that is strong inside the disciplines that we work in, but also tries to kind of really break those boundaries. And it's a great honor for me to say a few things about David Hughes' kind of work in this respect. So David's a professor of anthropology at Rutgers University in the USA. I think if you don't know him and you can read up on his work, you'll know that he's worked for a long time kind of as an activist scholar of race inequality and natural resources. And I think for kind of almost 40 years now has been grappling with these issues of natural resource use and its impact on kind of issues of race and kind of inequality. He's done a fair amount of work in our part of the world. So he worked for some time in Zimbabwe on kind of enslavement and kind of environmentalism and on kind of issues of whiteness in Zimbabwe. He's also worked in Trinidad and Tobago, where he's done work on energy. I think we were kind of pretty excited by his book, the title of which is kind of Who Owns the Wind? And I think it kind of raises really important issues about how we think about the transition from the world that we're in now to a world where kind of our impact on the climate is going to be a lot less than it is now. He's also the kind of president of his academic staff union in his university, and he serves on the climate justice task force for the American Federation of Teachers. So it's a real kind of pleasure for us to have you here, David, and we're really looking forward to your talk. With that, let me pass the floor on to you and say, if you're wanting to buy the book, we have a special arrangement with Love Books in Melville. If you just pop in there, they'll kind of happily order the book for you, and kind of reach out to them for the book. Come over to you, Deb.
All right. Thank you very much. Thanks for that introduction, Imraan. I'll just pass a display copy around. By the way, is there a nuclear waste dump in the third row here? Nobody wants to sit in that third. Feel free to move if you like. The title of my talk is Solar Socialism, Wind, Sunlight, and the Paradox of Abundance. Let's see. This is my outline, just to give you a sense of where we're going here. Let me talk for a minute about the nature of renewables here. Point number one. There we go. Point number one. It's important to distinguish how renewable energy, and I'll mostly be talking about wind and sunlight, are different from fossil fuels in very fundamental ways. The first thing to note is that fossil fuels are a stock. Coal, there is a certain number of megatons of coal under the ground in South Africa. That's not going to change in the course of our lifetimes. In the course of millions of years, maybe hundreds of millions of years, maybe more coal will be produced geologically. But in a human time scale, the amount of coal available is fixed, and every ton that burns means a ton less available, and eventually an industrial system would deplete that supply entirely. So that's a stock. A flow is the way renewables operate. They're coming to us constantly from the sun, and far more than from the sun and its derivatives, more than we can consume. But even if we could consume that entire flow, it would be fine, because there's more coming in the next second and the next day and the next year. So that's inexhaustible, and inexhaustible because it is coming to us every day from a celestial body. And here's what this looks like. This is kind of like the God chart of exergy. Exergy is just energy, including the stuff that comes from outside. So if we look, I'll just use the cursor here. This is 100, well, I should have given you a little little quiz on this. I'll start at the bottom. These are fossil fuels. And if you think of them as a flow in terms of the number of terawatts that we get constantly, terawatt being a measure of the rate of movement, of arrival, it's 11 or 12 terawatts that the entire human population is consuming continuously. So that's 11, maybe 12, fairly small compared to what we get from the sun. Even if you count, and even if you only count 86,000 terawatts as what stays on the Earth, stays on the Earth's surface, that's enormously large. There's no way, if we wanted to exhaust that. There's no way to store the excess. But as I say, it's no problem because they're coming constantly. So these are fugitive resources of an infinite supply. By the way, wind here is here, 870 terawatts. What they call, in terms of solar, solar energy, 0.016 terawatts or 160 gigawatts, 16 gigawatts. That's just solar radiation converted to electricity. So that's solar voltaic, solar concentrators, and so forth, which is a minuscule percentage of the available resource. So there are three consequences of the fact that we have this infinite fugitive but infinite resource. Huge abundance in the aggregate, but possibly severe shortages in certain times and places, and then no industrial metabolism because the resource brings itself to us. There's no lifting, there's no processing really, and therefore there's almost no work. So these are new circumstances to have an important resource with these characteristics, and renewables therefore stand almost entirely outside the socialist and capitalist theory that we're used to dealing with. This kind of abundance confounds Smithian, Malthusian, and Marxian doctrines based on limited supply. just to dwell for a minute on the lack of an industrial metabolism. An industrial metabolism is what Marx described somewhere in volume 3 of Capital. He talks about a kind of 3-stage process where you, and if I want to use the coal example, which is very salient here, you send men in, or machines now, to dig something up. You dig up this mineral, you move it somewhere. So that's the input stage, is the digging, the moving. Then in the throughput stage, you burn it. And then you have the output stage, which is on the one hand electricity, on the other hand a lot of pollution that also has the ash and so on, air pollution that also has to be managed in some way. So there's labor in each of those parts in a traditional industrial metabolism. With, say, a wind farm, well, the wind doesn't have to be dug up. It comes from the sky and it brings itself. The energy, part of the wind energy, is the transportation to arrive on site. And then there's a little bit of throughput in terms of a turbine to convert it to electricity. And then there's no output. There's no management of the output. The output is electricity, which is weightless, and it does require an electrician now and then, but very little labor on the electricity side, and there's no pollution. So no labor on the pollution side. This is a situation that we don't grapple with very well. The lightness, the ease of renewables. In fact, it's kind of a post-work situation. And we don't grapple very well with post-work. We're kind of allergic to it, in fact. If you're a Marxist or a capitalist, you really like work. So what we find is that the renewable energy industry is often looking for scarcity, often trying to invent scarcity, and at any rate, assuming scarcity erroneously in order to cope with an energy transition that might fall within our parameters. What happens is that the transition is slowing itself down, sometimes deliberately, in the search for scarcity. In a market sense, these, and I'll discuss this a little bit when I discuss so-called passive solar energy, these terawatts have actually no value. If you think about it, these terawatts are the reason that it is warmer here, even on what seems to be a fairly cold day in Johannesburg. It's a lot warmer here than it would be a few billion miles past Pluto, right? And that's what we would have. That would be the environment, did we not have these 162,000 terawatts. So the energy that keeps us alive through planetary warmth has no economic value. It has no price. And which means that the energy industry is if we're going to operate in market economics, is always going to have to forego most of the resource available. Right? That's a major problem for grappling with an energy transition. So I'm going to go through some solutions, both within and outside the kind of prevalent framework of scarcity, private property, and employment. And as I said, the scarcity side and the employment side are actually common to both left and right-wing understandings of economics. So I'll go through a bunch of examples. I have 4 of them. Let me talk a little bit about solar right now, about solar converted into electricity. So we have a problem right now that very little of the available solar resource, very little of that 162,000 terawatts is converted into electricity. And that's partly because of a kind of prior appropriation of the 86,000 terawatts that fall on the Earth's surface. Because of a prior appropriation of the Earth's surface as private property, often for land, often for agricultural land and other things, residential, even conservation. And so we have prior use. And this isn't too much of a problem when when the photons are actually being used, as in solar energy, as in photovoltaics, or a tanning roof, or any form of agriculture, right? And so we have a strong tradition of appropriating photons through agriculture for sure. But we also waste a lot. And so here's an example of terrible waste. This is the Mall of America. the largest mall in the world at one point. It's in Minnesota. It is, let me see here, 96 acres, which is about 40 hectares if you include the parking lots. It's got 5 buildings here in this parking lot. There are a few skylights, but otherwise, actually, this is the sky. Actually, this is the parking lot isn't even shown. This is all of it, and it's not being used. So what do you do about that situation? You have an urban area wasting photons. There actually is a solution, which you might call socialist, but it falls within the colonial tradition of the United States. I understand there's an effort to decolonize various things at Wits. I'm going to tell you about a little good thing that colonialism introduced as a principle, a good thing hidden within a bad thing. But first I have to explain that the Municipal Council of Minnesota identified this mall as what they call a solar reserve. And they mapped them into this part. It's actually Bloomington, Minnesota, which is a suburb of Minneapolis. They mapped it in this way, potential annual solar production. They found that they could cover very easily 25% of the electric consumption of the city just on these areas, which are large parking lots and large like warehouse roofs, things that are fairly easy to put solar panels on. If you covered the roofs of houses, then you could way exceed that 25%. So, but the trouble was that the municipality couldn't actually claim those terawatts, couldn't claim those photons because they're falling on land owned by somebody else. So I thought about how can you, within the fairly conservative traditions of the US and of many countries, how can you actually claim that surface? This is a little bit put differently. How can one change the property relationship between a landowner and sunlight? How can you deprivatize sunlight in a situation where it's not being used? All right. And so I'm advocating some kind of public ownership, but I'm advocating it through a really primordial kind of private ownership. And I'll go back to, I don't know how well this book is known. This is a child's story that everybody in the US read at a certain point about the colonization of the frontier in the 19th century, Laura Ingalls Wilder and all. And so Laura Ingalls Wilder is the most famous frontiersman of the US as a homesteader. Her family settled the Dakota Territory, which is now North Dakota, South Dakota, in the 1880s with a land grant made possible by the 1862 Homestead Act. This is actually going to sound a little bit like colonialism in Zimbabwe and possibly in South Africa too. So they got a grant from the government, which says, pursuant to the provisions of the Act of Congress approved in 1862, entitled an act to secure homeland to homesteads to actual settlers in the public domain. So this looks like a privatization act. The public domain, which was in fact owned by indigenous people, but formally titled to the government, was then given to actual settlers on the basis of 160 acres or 67 hectares for each family, free. And this is how indigenous lands were seized by European descended farmers all through the 19th century and into the 20th century in the western 2/3 of the US. But there actually is an interesting caveat. And there's this phrase, actual settlers. Not settlers, but actual settlers. So what an actual settler meant was something very specific. It meant that you had to be there, right? You can read through this here. I won't read it out loud, but you can read through it. So the person having filed such an act shall actually abandon that. Yeah. So the person cannot abandon the land. The person actually has to be farming the land. In Zimbabwe's land tenure debates, this would be the difference between utilized and underutilized land. And underutilized land in Zimbabwe has always been more subject to seizure by government than utilized land for reasons having to do with the kind of gospel of use of efficiently using nature's resources for human advance. So just take everything in the story I've told you about land and replace the word land with sunlight. And what you see is that sunlight that's not used shall revert to the government after 5 years. So what would that look like? Let's go back to this situation. You have all of these areas of sunlight and this roof not being used. Now you just have to think, we're not thinking horizontally here, we're thinking vertically. And so there is a kind of, on top of every structure, there is a kind of penthouse, an imaginary penthouse, where the photons are falling. And it's that penthouse, which under this logic can be seized by some level of government and turned into a solar farm. And what this would look like in a situation like the Mall of the Americas it's called, or maybe it's Mall of America, I can't remember. Minneapolis, the city of Minneapolis would say to the corporate owners of this, well, let's see, you haven't harvested that sunlight in a number of years. We're going to seize it from you. We'll give you a grace period of 1 year to put solar panels and hook them up over the entire structure. And after that grace period of 1 year, we're going to go up there onto your roof and put up our panels and hook them to the grid. And you don't have anything to say about it. It's like building a penthouse over somebody's apartment. You don't have anything to say about it, right? That's not a taking. That's not actually seizing property, because it's something that the Mall of America isn't using and really doesn't even think they have. The reason they're not using it is partly because they don't think it exists. And part of my effort here to finish off this section, part of my effort here is to get people to see sunlight and wind as things, as resources that can be fought over and contested, and in some economic systems given a price, given value, or so forth. But that's less important to me. What's more important to me is who has rights to these things and who owns them and who is prepared to put them to use. So let me give you another example of something almost entirely overlooked. This solar architecture is the architectural term for passive solar energy. Have people heard of passive solar energy? All right, I better explain. I don't see any. Raise your hand if you've heard of passive solar energy. All right, not a whole lot of people. So let me explain. When we hear the phrase solar energy, we usually think of converting photons to electrons, right? And you end up with electricity at the end of the day. And as I said in the first slide, only a tiny, minuscule portion of sunlight is converted into electricity. So we think, oh, well, that's right now, solar energy is fairly trivial. That's the active part. The passive part is all of the electricity, all of the solar radiation that's doing other stuff for us, like preventing us from freezing, like allowing us to read a book outside. We're getting a certain amount of light here from outside, I gather. Is that an external window? By the way, is this the top floor of the building? All right, anyway, but you know, we could get more if this thing had proper windows all around, then we could be using more direct sunlight and less electricity from these artificial lights. But we almost never think about this. So there is one example of where people thought about this. This is the Iliakohorio, or the solar village, built in the 1980s in a suburb of Greece and designed by Athens, Greece, and designed by the German government with a lot of US architects providing expertise. So they built for a union, in fact, or actually for a kind of collaboration between the Ministry of Work and various unions. They built this kind of workers' accommodation of 435 apartments. What interests me are the 34 of them, which are run completely through solar energy. So they have illumination, but they have no heating and cooling. And this is done by, on the south side, by sunlight hitting there, and was built cooled by north winds and warmed by sunlight that heats up stone structures that then store heat. These are called thermal masses that store heat during the day. That's what happens in the winter. In the summer, there are these shades that come down here, shades that come down and prevent the sunlight from hitting those thermal masses and provide shade. And so these units can run completely without air conditioning in a very hot climate, and with a very hot summer climate, and without heating, without artificial heating in a pretty cold winter climate. So this was built, and here's what it looks like in the summer with the awnings that I described them. And they have solar panels, but I think this is actually solar thermal on top. Solar panels are elsewhere hooked up. And there's another close-up. The rub or the catch in this Iliakohorio, and this is actually why it kind of failed. It failed in an interesting way, was that you had to do a lot of stuff to make this happen. So the accompanying manual written by an architect at the University of Pittsburgh in the US describes what people have to do. You have to do a lot of cleaning of the windows and things. It's very important that the sunlight get in. You have to do this turning of the awning. You have to take the awning off and stitch it back on. You have to clean the water benches, which are the thermal mass. You have to clean them quite a bit because you don't want mold building up. You have to do all this at different times during the season and during the day, right? And you have to turn these blinds, There's a whole lot of stuff you have to do. And so what was interesting is that people were not prepared to do all this work. There were people available to do all this work because even now, but especially 20 years ago, the typical Athenian household involved a woman who was at home and a man who was outside doing an industrial job. As I said, this was all done for various workers in industrial trade unions. So the wife was available, as shown in this picture, to do this work, but it wasn't really described as something important. It was understood by her as being a burden of unremunerated, unrecognized labor. And in doing a kind of thought experiment, I've wondered, what if we called that labor the economy of care, or the economy of our solar architecture, or the economy of passive solar energy, the economy of avoiding carbon emissions, because this is basically a zero carbon, not just net zero, but zero carbon household from a utilities point of view. And what if, for not emitting carbon dioxide, we paid her something, right? And that could be done as a payment for conservation, or it could be more likely, more holistically, it could be done as a universal basic income, where this person, who's also, by the way, taking care of kids very often in an unremunerated way, gets an income for the stuff that she does, the care that she does at home. And it doesn't have to be a woman, of course. Nowadays, it could be sometime from either partner, or the various different family and household arrangements. But one of the reasons why this kind of household labor has not been remunerated in the past must center on the kind of denigration of women's status and the kind of work that women conventionally have done. So one of the things we can start to imagine, I think is necessary to imagine for an energy transition, is compensating people for the kinds of hands-on economy of care work that actually stands outside the industrial metabolism. Okay, that's my example of so-called passive solar energy. Now I'm going to talk about something that's in the book circulating around about wind power in Spain. I started this was an ethnographic project that I carried out from 2013 to 2017, on and off, spending 6 months in one of the windiest places in the world. This is the Strait of Gibraltar, so that's Spain and that's Morocco. And there is the Levante, the easterly wind flows through here quite predictably. And it gets funneled through two fairly low mountain ranges there. And this is a place where there are hundreds of wind turbines surrounding this little village of 400 people. And you can't see all the wind turbines. Here are some. There's the coast. Here's Morocco, in fact. And there are many more off to the left-hand side. I went to this place thinking, this is the future. Here are people living on the renewable energy landscape. Let me see what that's like. And it didn't take me long to find out that they all hate it. And people had, in fact, protested these turbines when they were built, when the first round of them was built in 2006 to 2007. They had done civil disobedience. They'd blocked the roads and things, lay down in front of a cement mixer, and they mostly lost. But they succeeded well enough. They got enough press. They embarrassed the provincial government that these turbines here were the last ones installed in the province in 2010. And at that point, the energy transition for wind really stalled in Spain. It had been the fourth highest for for wind density on the grid. It stopped there at 18 or 19, maybe 20% by now. But the rate of installation slowed tremendously. This has happened in much of Western Europe because of protest movements. So it's very important to understand where those protest movements come from. Part of the reason it stalled as well is that the wind industry found the protest movements to be kind of convenient. There's a bit of a dirty secret in many places, which is that the wind and solar industries don't want to expand too fast. And this gets back to the market economics part. If you expand too fast, then you're producing so many megawatts of renewable energy. You may exceed portfolio standards in some US states. You may drive the price, and this has happened, drive the price of those megawatts down towards zero and sometimes into negative territory, forcing curtailment. And if you succeed too well, you may also undercut fossil fuels. And remember, many of the people and many of the governments investing in renewables are also investing in fossil fuels. And their economic model is probably to keep fossil fuels going for some time and to layer renewables on top of that, making money in both of these subsectors, right? So for that, we need a slow energy transition, a slow additive energy transition, rather than a fast substitutive energy transition. So in all these ways, there's not an alliance, but there's a congruence of interest among the wind among some actors in the wind sector and some actors in the anti-wind protest movement. But let me tell you what I found when I did the ethnography. People in this village told me the kinds of things you'd expect on the first round of conversations. Well, they don't like the wind farms because they make noise, they kill birds, they look ugly, there's these kinds of unsightly industrial monstrosities. But then you scratch beneath the surface and you find people would tolerate all that if it wasn't for the guy who took this photo, who's a guy called Carlos Nunez. He owns all the land that you saw on the previous slide around that village. And in fact, to go back there, he owns all this land around it. And this village is in fact a squatter settlement in legal terms that began in the 1950s on the edges of his estate and on this riverine public access cattle trail. In fact, they just basically expanded out from the cattle trail, which is what squatters would do, right? So anyway, Carlos Nunez owns all of this. And so he's grazing cattle, mostly for bullfighting, on the wind turbines. And he has a good sense of perspective. So this is a 90-meter tower and a 60-meter blade. But if you take it from the right angle, it looks like the bull is kissing it. And the wind farm rescued his cattle business. He was going bankrupt. It's a very undercapitalized sector. I could get into the history of settlement in southern Spain since 1492 with the expulsion of Muslims and the partial replacement by Christian Castellano speakers. It's really been undersettled, undercapitalized land, and wind turbines added value to this, value that the people in that village have never seen. And let me explain precisely what goes on here, because then this gets into the question of who owns the wind, the title of my book. Carlos Nunez gets paid twice. He gets paid a rent for this small, kind of half football pitch size pad at the base of the turbine. You can't see it in that picture, but he's getting paid rent, and he's getting paid some rent for the square meters of road leading up to that turbine. And that seems to be fair because that's land taken out of the production, out of pasturage that he'd normally be raising cattle on. But then he's also paid a royalty for a portion of the value of the electricity, which is to say the kinetic energy of the wind flowing over his farm, right? And you ask yourself, well, why should he get paid for a royalty for the value of the wind, right? He actually never bought that wind. He never bought the land either. It was confiscated from the Moors in the 15th century. But, you know, he didn't even conquer the wind. It's just kind of an accident, right? He hasn't invested in the wind, hasn't put an irrigation system up for it or anything, hasn't channeled it in any particular way. And it's really an accident. His wind rights are an accident that goes back to something called the ad coelum principle, developed by this 13th century Tuscan jurist called Sino da Pistoia, who was adjudicating in some town in Tuscany, adjudicating roof lines and the way that neighbors would tend to build up a second story on their house and make it wider and kind of actually cross the plane in a city onto the neighbor's parcel, right? So the ad coelum is the Latin word for to the sky. And so da Pistoia says, well, the person who owns the land owns it up to the sky. Unclear what the elevation of the sky is. It's also unclear. Planes have access rights under modern law, but this is the principle. It goes that far back that gives this guy, Carlos Nunez, the right to own those wind royalties. And that's really what pissed people off in this little village, is that they were getting nothing, and they were getting no rents, no income stream from the wind, and that their traditions of the wind, this Levante wind, were in no way recognized or honored, and their relationship to it was severed through privatization. Suddenly the wind was privatized at a stroke. So what to do about that? I'm rounding things out a little bit here. What one could say is that the wind is a public resource. It is a supra-surface resource, not in similar to the subsurface resource, going in the other direction. Again, for all of this, you have to think vertically. And I gather in South Africa, as in most countries, mineral rights belong to the state, regardless of who owns the surface. Is that correct? Right. So it's logical to say that resources in the other direction belong to the state and not to the person who owns the land. That's a harder principle to articulate in the US or in Spain, because bizarre subsurface rights are private in those two countries. But those are extraordinary circumstances. And what makes this path unusual is that I'm suggesting, in fact, not to fight over the land. Because the other thing is, if you say if wind rights belong to land rights, well, carry out land reform. And then that's been tried in Spain for about 150 years. There have been, this is part of why Franco took over, waged a war against the Second Republic from 1936 to 1939, was because the Second Republic, Socialist Republic, was beginning land redistribution, right? And of course, Franco was not interested in that, and neither has democratic Spain carried out land reform. So, one could reignite an old battle and fight over land. And there are fights over land in Zimbabwe, certainly, and in South Africa too. And I hope they succeed, in fact. But I'm suggesting something a little bit different, and that I think has a different chance of success, which is to fight over something that has never been fought over before, because landowners mostly don't even know that they own wind rights. And certainly they're underutilizing those wind rights in most cases. So why not simply sever land rights from wind rights through a judicial act or legislative act, and establish those as either wind rights as national, or owned by the municipality, or owned by the viewshed of the prospective wind farm. This gives that community the right to a revenue stream, but really more importantly, a right to negotiate at the table for how many wind turbines, what siting, what model of wind turbine, what the lines of sight are, all these types of things, so that it becomes a community project. And one thing they would certainly negotiate for, we were talking about this before, is access to the electricity through some kind of mini grid, which is very good for their own resilience in the case of a massive storm or some kind of climate impact. So this is why I say this is not a capitalist or a socialist path. This is a path based on a different kind of struggle for an unclaimed and super abundant resource. Okay, let me summarize all of this by put it all together by talking about the two paths we're on here. We're on a mostly capitalist path that looks like this. A small number of large projects, enormous wind farms or enormous solar farms, which are similar to the enormous coal stations or nuclear stations that we have. They're remote from where most people live, under private ownership, or maybe under central state ownership, through various subsidized in all kinds of ways from the public coffer. And I shouldn't say no jobs created, but few jobs created because of this metabolism I've been describing. So this is the kind, and let me dwell for a minute on the small number of large projects. The way capital has organized the fossil fuel sector is to have very large stations for generating electricity connected to very large transmission lines, highly capitalized. There are only a small number of firms in any single country that can manage that kind of investment. And so it leads to a concentration of wealth and power in a kind of energy oligopoly, right? In Spain, they call this the Brotherhood of Steel. Oh no, excuse me, they call it the Brotherhood of Cement, which also includes their nuclear industry. And that's terrible from a point of view of equality and of mass empowerment. Right now, the renewable energies, large firms, I think I was talking to one of you about Acciona, the Spanish firm. Iberdrola is another one in Spain. EDP, which is the French one, or the Portuguese one. EDF, which is the French one. And not to mention Siemens. These are firms which are positioned to build and install enormous wind turbines. Let's talk about wind for a minute. Enormous wind turbines. And the ones I showed you on the slide were 2 megawatts. Now there's a 14 megawatt machine that's being developed for offshore installations. These are absolute monstrosities that only very small number of institutions can actually grapple with, right? And they have to be connected to a very large transmission grid. So that's just replicating what we had in fossil fuels. And it's leading to brittleness of the grid. It's leading to a very small number of jobs because these large turbines are intended to run like robots, run in an automated way. It's leading to machines that nobody really wants to live in the vicinity of them because they do rupture the historical aesthetics, the vernacular architecture of a landscape. And it's leading to machines that don't actually get built. I get into arguments with engineers because at Rutgers, they think I'm crazy because I proposed an offshore wind turbine where the blades were sailcloth. So it would sort of look like a sailboat where the sails are spinning instead of pushing the craft forward. And for coastal communities that have a tradition of sailing, it fits with their history of aesthetics. And so the engineers and economists said, that's crazy. Do you know how you'd have to be going up there every couple of months and replacing the sailcloth with, I mean, why would you do that when you can have carbon fiber blades that last, 10, 20 years? And I said, great, that's jobs. That's send people up there to replace the sailcloth. That's fantastic. But no, we've got a kind of jobless energy transition happening for. here. So what I call solar socialism involves a large number of small projects almost everywhere. We might not even want to call them projects. This is like a situation where wherever you have a telephone pole, you also have a solar panel and a wind turbine on top of it, maybe. Maybe you have on roof lines in cities, you have vertical axis wind turbines. They can be put right next to each other if you have a prevailing wind. So this generates electricity where people live, avoiding the tremendous cost, the tremendous concentration of political power in a transmission grid, and the vulnerability of a transmission grid to weather disruptions and so on. Under public ownership, not necessarily central government, could be municipal government, could be cooperatives and so on, distributing these benefits to whatever public it is. And the final point is some understanding that we're all doing care work of one kind or another, whether it's care work that conserves energy through this cleaning of windows and adjusting of shades, or whether it's care work that reproduces families, takes care of the elderly, takes care of children, or whether it's care work where you're just sitting there getting high and smoking on your and playing your guitar, whatever. It contributes to society. And where does the money come from this? Well, in the energy sector, you have to imagine that converting a coal plant into a solar farm, or many solar farms, if it produces the same amount of electricity, then it earns the same revenue. Now, 99% of the jobs evaporate, but the revenue is still there. So there's money to pay those people who used to be paid to do jobs in the coal sector. This is, in fact, exactly how the longshoreman industry was retired in the US and other countries, mostly the US, with the advent of container shipping in the 1980s. They negotiated for those revenues to be paid for them even when they weren't actually working at the job. And that's something we could consider in a just energy transition. That is, that then it becomes a just energy transition that's not centered on jobs and work, but is centered on livelihood and well-being. So let me end there. I'd love to entertain any questions, and thank you very much. All right,
you stand there,
okay,
and you can answer. And I'll
okay.
Do the Q&A. Great. Thank you so much for that, David. A really kind of challenging kind of set of ideas about how we might think about kind of about how economies may or may not work. So let me then just open it up for any thoughts, any feedback, any questions anyone has. We have a kind of smaller audience in the room than we do kind of outside, but since you took the trouble to be here, we'll kind of equalize the questions and take an equal number inside the room and kind of outside. And what I'll do is 2 around inside, take 3 inside, and we then shift online. And Julia's going to kindly help me with the questions online by reading them out. So I see Jen. Let's start with Jennifer.
Thanks very much for a very interesting talk. I'm not an economist, nor am I very au fait with the differences in terms of the broad political approaches, but I do have an interesting question in the context of South Africa, particularly over the last year and a half in the wake of load shedding and where there were government incentives for installing solar at a household level. And where that did create quite considerable job creation within that solar market, particularly with relatively small and medium-sized enterprises who were able to move into that space in terms of acquiring the solar panels and then the installation, and then bringing in more specialist electricians to do the compliance certificates, and in many cases having 2 separate groups of people, one who installed and one did the compliance certificate. So I wonder if that is perhaps something that's fairly unique to South Africa, where we suddenly had a huge incentive for people to move towards solar, both in terms of tax incentives, but also the fact that people were fed up with load shedding. And if that creates a different kind of dynamic in terms of bringing in smaller contractors who have then a very sudden, urgent demand for solar installation than perhaps you might find elsewhere in the world.
So I saw two hands here. Let's take the one behind Crispian, and then Crispian.
My name's Sunny. My name's Sunny. I'm known as Sunny the Solar Guy. I've installed solar around the province for a long time. It was black magic when I was doing it 12 years ago. So I'm struggling to find or to understand what problem are we solving in what Prof was saying. I'm going to buy the book, so maybe the book will answer. Because in South Africa, there's no shortage of space for energy, for renewables, for solar, and for wind. The transition is beginning to address the issue of socially owned renewable energy. It's becoming an important conversation in the union movement and in the industry itself. In fact, solar as an industry has literally collapsed in South Africa for 120 days of no load shedding because it's primarily driven by that aspect. So I'm struggling to understand this issue of space and the professor's notion that perhaps we must price the sun, price the photons, and price the wind. As socialist-leaning activists or as socialist activists, we actually don't want it to be priced. We think that the solar industry in South Africa, renewables are not growing because the elites haven't identified how to price the sun and the wind. So we don't have the problem that the Prof is articulating, I think. And just the last point is the tax incentive did not galvanize the industry in South Africa. It was only 15,000 for private households, and it has actually been cancelled. What drove the energy transition was stage 6 load, not the energy transition, the rapid take-up of solar in South Africa was stage 6 load shedding. And now that there's no load shedding, businesses of small and micro enterprises are struggling to survive.
Crispin?
Yeah, David, thank you. That was an absolutely fascinating talk. I think you've put some very interesting questions on the table, particularly around ownership of the resources. And even, you don't have to necessarily buy a whole hog, nationalization of all the resources. I think the idea you put on the table of a sort of use it or lose it principle is very interesting. So, they're slightly, there's some easier steps we could take to trigger this broader movement around public ownership. My question is, where does the money come from? In your solar socialism model, the classic model is because the big cost of both solar and wind is the upfront capital cost, and that's traditionally a combination of debt and equity. You can borrow between 60 or 80% of the money on the open market, but you've got to put a slug of your own equity in to make the deal hold. And that's been, we've, as the Climate Commission, been pushing this idea of socially owned renewable projects. But the obstacle we come up against is, where does the money come from? There are some interesting solutions we're exploring. I mean, for instance, a number of worker-owned pension funds exist who are already interested in the sector and are potentially making some investments around it. But, it is happening on the margins. It's not happening merely at the kind of scale that would trigger the kind of revolution you're talking about.
Wait, let me pass it back to you. So
Yeah.
perhaps you want to deal with those three, and then we'll do around online.
Yes, thank you. Those are great questions. Jennifer, let me say, yeah, I haven't studied South Africa on this question, so I'm not fully aware of the small and medium installers you say were given a boost by load shedding. I'm great that that happened, although Sunny is saying it hasn't lasted. I do want to say a word about load shedding. This is going to seem insensitive, but I live with load shedding in Zimbabwe and without electricity entirely in Zimbabwe. I think it's actually not a bad idea, because we may have to become accustomed to using electricity with a different kind of schedule. Some people refer to this as solarizing your lifestyle. So if we had a grid dominated by solar energy, then the peak production would be at midday. Unfortunately, right now, peak consumption in most countries is in the late afternoon, early evening. In fact, after sun has set in many cases. And that's a problem. And people say, well, let's put in a lot of lithium batteries to solve that problem. Lithium batteries and lithium mining and so on creates other problems for the people downwind and downstream of lithium mines who might be indigenous people in Bolivia, for example. And also, it just raises the cost. Lithium raises the cost of installation, slows everything down through the kinds of finance squeeze that Crispin was talking about. So one way to do that is to what's called shave the peak. And a lot of activists in the US have been encouraging this in the summer because we do have had such heat waves, which through air conditioning really push up demand on the grid. So the idea is, you know, consume electricity when it's more available. And, you know, if you're doing heating and cooling, do that. Maybe in abundance, because as I say, we'll have solar energy in abundance on a solar dominated grid at midday. So superheat, super cool your house during the day and let that carry you through the evening. Some people even say make your main meal lunchtime, or your hot meal is lunchtime. That's when you're using the electricity for cooking and whatever, and have a cold supper at nightfall. Right. So these are ways that we could live in a more energy constrained and more sustainable world. And I say it's not actually, in terms of solar, it's not actually constrained in aggregate, quite the opposite. But at nighttime, it is constrained episodically. To Sunny's problem in terms of what problem I'm attempting to solve. I may be attempting to solve a problem that's more characteristic of the global north than South Africa. I admit to that. So the problem I'm attempting to solve, and you guys can tell me whether this is a problem at all in South Africa, is a lack of public support for the build out of renewable energies. Is that you have these siting battles, which I talked about, but you also have really a kind of a lack of enthusiasm. And the fact that the solar industry got a boost simply because of load shedding suggests a lack of real embrace of the need to replace fossil fuels with renewables for the sake of the conditions of life on planet Earth. So how do you build a popular movement that really embraces every class and every sector and every region of society? You need to create a situation where people have a stake politically and economically in the energy transition. And something like a wind commons, I think, helps achieve that. Let's see, where does the money come from, Crispin? Good question. I'm not an expert on that. I mean, there are all sorts of ideas floated. I'm sure you know about this, public banks, green banks, to provide that upfront investment. To some extent, I think investors are holding out because, as I said, in part, they want a slower energy transition than otherwise. Also, they're holding out because they're waiting for a public subsidy. Maybe they're holding out because they don't quite realize how cheap renewable energy is. It has always puzzled me that we have this question of people debate about levelized costs and things, where we know that the marginal cost, once you build everything, the marginal cost of producing a megawatt hour of solar energy is effectively zero. and the marginalized producing a megawatt of electricity from solar is effectively zero. And the marginal cost of producing a megawatt hour from coal is a whole lot greater than zero. So this ought to be kind of a no-brainer. And instead, what the industry did is they invented a 25-year lifespan for a solar plant or a wind turbine, and they kept, which is erroneous. Solar plant panels can last a lot longer than that. And nobody really knows how long one of these huge wind turbines will last. So they artificially raised the per year cost of installation and created this whole, slowed us down with 20 years of the industry trying to reduce levelized generation costs for wind and solar when they already were low enough. But I don't have a whole lot more to say about the cost of things. Let's take another round.
Great. Let's then shift online. So I've got a few hands, but I want to just take around online. So I'm going to pass it to Julia to read up 2 or 3 questions, Julia.
Thanks. So we have a question from Professor Mary Scholes, which is, have you ever worked with communities whose cultural beliefs include ownership of wind? Then there's a question from YM. Are there promising examples of small-scale renewables in communities you've interacted with, similarly with UBIG for care work? How do we operationalize these concepts in a country like South Africa?
Wait, can you repeat that? What was the example that the person gave?
Promising examples of small-scale renewables in communities you've interacted with, or UBIG for care work, so Universal Basic Income Grant. And then the last question I'll take for now, there are a few others, but maybe we can come back, is from Karen Ayerton. In your model of taking ownership of the roof space, who holds responsibility for maintenance, etc., and what rights of access are required?
Okay. Let me take this in reverse order this time. In my dream of appropriating roofs, appropriating actually the space above roofs for solar panels, the municipality would own that space and would maintain it. Take all the responsibility for maintaining it. They'd have to negotiate a use access agreement with whoever owns the roof and the building. And people think this is some kind of a deal breaker and that it would be impossible. But in the example I gave with the penthouse, in any multi-story structure, there is differentiated ownership and rights for the stories, and a whole nother thing for the roof, and another thing if there's a pool or a terrace or who knows what, or solar panels already on the roof, right? So this is the kind of thing that private property in capitalism already deals with, is these vertical layers. I don't think that's a deal breaker. In terms of small scale renewables in communities where I haven't done research in this circumstance, but microgrids are becoming very prevalent in the state where I live in New Jersey. Some of them are actual, where people are hardwired. You can hardwire a clinic or a hospital to a microgrid, which is only separated by one roadway. So roofs around. We have proposed this for my university, where my administration is not very keen on it. I understand there's some discussion of this stuff at Wits. You could do this at Wits quite well, with all the roofs occupied by solar, and also if there's a hospital nearby. Or what you really actually need for resilience is you need what's called a resilience hub, and that involves some refrigerator space. I'm gonna get into the weeds a tiny bit here. What we found in hurricanes in the US, particularly Maria that hit Puerto Rico about 5 years ago, more people die because their medicines heat up. Insulin, like defrosts or whatever, gets too hot to use. More people die from that over a long-term grid failure than die from the wind and the flooding and whatever caused the grid failure in the first place. And it's ridiculous. If the sun is shining after the storm, you should be able to harvest that electricity through solar panels and have a community fridge that keeps medicine cold, and have charging ports for medical devices, for communication devices, for basic emergency electricity like that. That's the kind of thing that can be done for a microgrid that in good days supplies everybody with some electricity in the neighborhood, and on bad days supplies the people who really need it with emergency electricity. You can get the idea. I'm shading over a little bit onto the adaptation side. Most of this talk is about mitigating carbon emissions, but and I used to not want to talk about adaptation at all because I thought it was a distraction from mitigation. But now that we're in early climate change, heading towards middle climate change, we need to basically talk about how to save our people. And that means vulnerable people in cities who unfortunately right now are really far from electricity generation and have very little access to it. The last question, that's a very good question. I ought to know more about that as an anthropologist. Communities whose cultural beliefs include ownership of the wind. There is a principle among Maori in New Zealand which refers to this. And there was a piece of legislation passed. I mentioned this in the book, so this is encouraging you to go out and buy the book, Who Owns the Wind, because you can find it there more readily than I can remember what I wrote. There was some very high-level legislation that's enshrined the Maori cultural ownership of the wind, but I think it was such a high-level and abstract legal document that it hasn't had the effect that I described of severing wind rights and land rights, and it hasn't had an effect on actually the renewable energy industry. Mm-hmm.
Great. So let's take one more round. I'm going to take one from there. This kind of gentleman had his hand up in the round before, and then and then go behind him. But before I go to Hilton, I just wanted to share with people a trial that the university is conducting, which kind of relates to the previous round of questions. So we've made a large investment in an urban demographic surveillance site in Johannesburg and Pretoria. And one of the trials that's being run on that site is to provide some kind of informal settlement households with kind of solar, and we're observing what happens, what are the kind of economic things that take place, and how might we think about some sort of microgrid effect from that. So just wanted to share that with you. But let's go to Hilton, and then the gentleman next to Crispin, and then the woman behind.
What I really appreciated was that you, in your thought about solutions, you spend so much time thinking creatively about decentralized, relatively small-scale approaches that don't require radical social change as the precondition for anything to happen. Which is normally where left approaches to these kinds of problems have been stalled, right? The notion that everything is deferred until there's a radical reorganization of society at large. So I found that really promising. It gives optimism to what can be done in, you're not eliminating the short-term future in the way that you're thinking about this. But then there's the flip side to that is that with any kind of infrastructural development, the social relations that are in place are locked in and given durability through that infrastructural development. I mean, the madness of our housing approach in South African cities to put people further and further away in ways that will have generations-long consequences. So I was doing a thought experiment with what you were suggesting, something that has often occurred to me as I drive through the countryside in South Africa. There's a very common spatial pattern in small towns in the South African countryside. And that's that normally at some kind of low-lying sheltered place, often along a stream between hills, there's the old settler town, normally more than 100 years old. And because of that age, with a canopy of trees. So in a very hot environment, it's much more comfortable. And then at a distance, about a kilometer or so, there's the township, where Black people live on a very exposed, normally up on the hillside, under very exposed conditions, exposed to sun, exposed to wind, exposed to rain, in ways that make life very uncomfortable. especially given the kind of housing stock that there is, which is often metal and so on. So, you know, one could imagine redistributive municipal mini-grids, where those exposed places high up on the hillside are the locations for energy production that gives revenue to people who are there as some kind of compensation for the situation in which they find themselves. But it creates a perverse incentive in sustaining segregation. So it was just, you know, I don't know if this makes much sense, but I wonder if you could reflect on where social relations are in your picture, because I can see the urgency of your emphasis on what can be done without waiting for some kind of epochal change in how society is organized. And that's obviously fundamental. But how do you still go about doing this in ways that do push social relations in different directions without fossilizing them?
Right, over to you.
Thanks very much for the presentation. Sorry. Hi, thanks for the presentation. And my name is Richard Worthington. I work with civil society, supporting renewables and climate action, etc. There's two things I'd like to get to. One of them is really when you started talking about that our socioeconomic systems have a problem with abundance. And I was just wondering if you could unpack that a little further, because, you know, it's clear why big energy companies that are invested in fossils and renewables just want additive. In South African civil society, if it's purely additive, we don't call it transition. It's got to be substitutive, or it's just economic growth. Don't try and pass that off as a transition of any kind. And you also talked about the renewable industry fostering scarcity as a way of, I guess, being able to claim higher profits for their activity. But I wonder if you could just unpack that a little more. You know, when you refer to the brotherhood of cement, I get the idea, yeah, okay, so if you're in cement, you love wind farms being built or nuclear, whatever, anything that uses cement. I'm wondering how much that's sort of cartelism or what might be part of it, or if there are other aspects of the fact that wind and solar are free, but we are working within a capitalist system that serves to marginalize the use of resources that, apart from the equipment to harvest them, are, as you say, outside the industrial metabolism. Thanks.
Thanks. Igor Gledhill from engineering. I must confess I'm a bit worried by the prospect of putting access to the sun and the wind out, giving it a price. But there's something that worries me a little more. This is a comment from a South African point of view. If it's put under public or private management, we have some track records to consider in the country, especially for public management. We have a track record in terms of managing technical entities like airlines, telephone systems, ports, railway lines, road systems, hospitals, clinics, national parks, conservation, and museums. And so I'm not that keen to put anything under public management in South Africa at present. The reason may be greed, but that applies to private industry as well. So that's merely a comment.
There's three for you.
All right, very challenging questions. I may not be able to do them all justice here. Was it Gilpin? I didn't quite. Gilton. Hilton? What? Oh, Hilton. Okay. Yeah, I hear what you're saying here. I guess you're suggesting that if somebody puts a microgrid in a township, that's going to make it impossible for a reformulation of a relocation and reformulation of segregated and totally unjust housing patterns, and it will lock people into that township underneath their roofs with their solar panels for quite a long time. Yeah, I guess I would plead guilty to that because the moderation in this proposal is to say that we need a transition that is substitutive and is wide scale and is very fast. And the kind of social reorganization that I have fought for in other areas of life has proved to be very slow, because we've been trying for a long time. And so we don't have the luxury of trying to solve all problems at once. We have to solve the problem that threatens the lives of a good chunk of 8 billion people as quickly as possible, right? So, and you're not necessarily locked in, because any solar panel can be moved without enormous cost. Just reinstall it on some other roof. And so I don't think we might not be as locked in as you're suggesting, but also I think we need a popular energy transition that doesn't provoke a popular widespread energy transition within existing social understandings that doesn't get stalled for a century because it threatens elites too much. So I could be saying, especially with this discussion of the Homestead Act, it's an elite tolerant, elite compliant, but not elite led energy transition that I'm recommending. But I'm open to your kind of criticism. Yeah, so in terms of what you're saying, Richard, there is a section in the book where I follow the work of a Columbia economist. I can't remember the guy's name. Again, so it's in the book, which is available from this bookstore in Melville. And what he has talked about, this was such a shining example to me, because he said out loud what I think a lot of people are saying quietly, which is that we have to limit the available spaces to put wind. He was talking about put wind farms on. In order to create value. And he believes in formally creating wind reserves that are similar to oil reserves and would be booked by various firms and then used as wind is installed. It's an analogy that doesn't really make sense, because, as I said at the very beginning, oil is a stock, wind is a flow, but the land underneath the wind farm is a stock. So let's see. So that gets to the way that the industry is trying to create scarcity in order to maintain market value. What I didn't talk about, because that would be rupturing the kinds of what would be a complete overturning of various capitalist systems, would be not to have any market in electricity at all. And then one wouldn't be limited. One wouldn't be limited by the abundance or the pricelessness of the unpriced nature of renewables. One would have some other kind of social allocation mechanism, maybe not only a universal basic income, as I suggested, but a universal basic electricity. That's also possible. And I wouldn't, I'd welcome other people to work on that. But as I say, I'm coming up with a moderate, pragmatic approach. Let's see, in terms of pricing, what was your name? I didn't catch your name either, ma'am, I'm afraid. Yeah.
It's Eagle.
Signal?
Eagle.
Eagle. Okay. So in terms of pricing, yes. I mean, I'm not an ecological economist. I do think you do a certain violence to the intrinsic value of something when you put a price on it. However, everywhere it's developed, except possibly China, has a price, and these wind royalties are being negotiated now by savvy landowners and so on. So I'm not financializing a resource that isn't already financialized. Yeah, your point also about the corruption of public institutions is a South African concern for sure. That argues against making the federal government or any level of government be put in charge of wind rights or solar rights. So maybe there's some other institution. Maybe there's some neighborhood co-op. Maybe there's something else that can be created. I would say an institution, especially when we're talking about a microgrid, an institution of the consumers of the resource, who then become the owners of the resource, has the kind of incentives built in that makes it more likely to succeed than South African Airways. Yeah.
Right, let's do a second round online, Julia.
Thanks. So a question from Arthur Maviza. Wind turbines and photovoltaics have a limited lifespan beyond which those totally dependent on them will be required to return to the suppliers for new investment. Without a just north-south technology transfer to produce these technologies in Africa, how can a just transition be achieved in Africa without locking the poor into perpetual dependency? The second question is from an anonymous person. In a world where funding is sufficient, are small rural and urban solar projects able to fully replace existing electricity sources? And then one more question from Shinta Jennifer. How do you handle security of microgrids, for example, vandalism and theft of turbines and solar panels?
With you.
Okay, Arthur's question here. Nobody really knows in terms of limited lifespan. There are solar panels installed in the 70s that converted about 10%, maybe 15% of insolation into electricity. And now they've slipped by a few percentage points, right? That's fine. Most people see that as very uneconomic because you could replace them with a panel that converts 20 or 22%, right? And maybe it's economic to do that. This is what happens. This is what happened, in fact, in the region of Spain. They installed a bunch of wind turbines in 1990 something, and those wind turbines were only half a megawatt or a couple hundred kilowatts. And then they decided, after 25 years, we'll do this thing called repotentiación, which means repotentializing. They would just replace them with 2 megawatt turbines. The half megawatt turbines were still generating slightly, with some slight marginal loss of efficiency and so on, but they were working well enough, right? And so the only reason that we're retiring wind and solar farms is because there's a more profitable still technology that you can slot into the same space. And you don't have to pay for permitting and legal fees and everything if you replace one solar farm with another solar farm, right? Now, it would be much better for the energy transition if you keep that solar farm going at 15% efficiency and you build another one somewhere else at 20% efficiency. But that's possibly less profitable. So I think we'll have to wait and see what the lifespan of a solar panel really is until it gets down to 0%. We'll all be long dead, I think, by the time that happens. It's a fantastic technology because it doesn't have an industrial metabolism. There's no moving parts except electrons. There's nothing being lifted. There's nothing burning. There's nothing bashing. There's nothing crashing, right? Which means also there are very few jobs for the people doing the bashing and crashing. So it's, again, I should talk about an abundance of the resource and also an abundance of time involved in this, of longevity. In terms of the question, the first anonymous question, I think the question was whether we actually can replace fossil fuels with renewables. The chart I showed makes it clear that even on a small land area, the first chart, the exergy chart, even on a small land area, we can generate the same, for electric conversion, we can generate the same number of terawatts that we get from fossil fuels. Now there are, and even if all of our vehicles and so on become electrified, we've still got the land area and we've got the technology. We had the technology in the 1970s, in fact, to do all this. And by the way, none of my aspirations here depend on developing any new technologies. Unlike the coal industry folks this morning who dream of all kinds of technologies that are just pie in the sky at this point. The energy transition has always had everything. It has had for 50 years, every technology it needs. The tricky thing, though, may be time of death. And and people concerned, and time of day, this is one way in which the opponents of renewables are exaggerating, emphasizing, inventing scarcity. Solar energy is scarce at night, wherever it is night. This is true. This is unavoidable. And storage is expensive. Storage is not, some of those technologies are not fully developed. So, right, you have a couple of solutions to that. As I said, you can consume electricity, solar generated electricity when it is scarce, or when it is, when it is abundant at midday. There are also some remarkably captivating solutions. There's a project called Solar Protocol, which basically makes use of the disjuncture between the grid for electricity and the grid for data. And what they do, they're a network of universities all over the world at most longitudes. And they generate solar on university campuses, and they do data crunching where the sun is shining. And then they ship the data through fiber optics to where it's needed. So if you're doing a big computer operation in South Africa right now, the sun is falling, sun is setting, send it over to the US through fiber optics. In the US, where the sun is still shining, they will do all that operation through solar photovoltaics and send it back, right? And to the extent that we're now with AI and all this other stuff, a huge amount of our electricity use is going to go into data crunching, which is incredible, which is with zero weight and incredibly portable. Right. So that's thinking of the whole planet as a kind of celestial grid where we can optimize solar energy for the production that we need at a given time.
Great. So,
oh wait, I didn't address the vandalism and the theft issue. I don't have a good
answer that in come quickly. We'll
okay.
Be just before 6 p.m. and
my answer is I don't have a good answer to that. If I have 22 solar panels on my roof, and the only people who vandalize it are squirrels, and that is a major problem. Get squirrel guards if you live in a continent that has squirrels, these little rodents that chew through anything. But I don't have a good answer. If somebody's going to throw rocks at a solar panel, I hope they burn in hell. I don't know.
Okay, so we're just before 6 p.m. and that gives me the license to allow one more round of questions inside the room, just so that we don't drag this out too much. I'll kind of ask you to just keep it short. So Matthew had his hand up, so I'm going to kind of allow him. Is there anyone else? Okay, let's just take the one question.
A quick question, which is you approach conscious quite strongly with someone like Jason Hickles and the whole degrowth perspective, which gives a lot more emphasis to the other forms of inputs, lithium and so on in the batteries, and his argument and other degrowth people are that you can't have this infinite expansion because of the other inputs involved. So my question is, how does your position contrast to that, and how do you account for the other types of mining and so on that goes into particularly batteries?
Yeah.
Right. For kind of equity, Julia, do you have one question from the online?
I was busy apologizing to them.
Oh, okay, all right, let's move on then.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm not keen on the kind of degrowth language because at least in the US, it's an immediate turnoff to most people. Unfortunately, we think of growth as being and GDP and all this being the be and end all, and you're going to lose most of your audience if you talk about degrowth. And they don't in fact mean degrowth. They mean less growth in extraction, for example. The economy, the economy of care is something we might like to grow, even in GDP terms. And in fact, if you measure things a certain way, universal basic income payments would grow the GDP enormously because that then counts as income, and which is because GDP is an absurd measure of economic livelihood in the first place. So but also, I think that Hickel and the others are embracing scarcity in a way that's unnecessary and a little bit misleading. we could, through the example I just gave of solar protocol, we could grow our data processing enormously and still remain within the confines of what solar energy is available at that latitudes where you're doing the data longitudes where you're doing the data processing. So I think it's unnecessarily constraining to advocate degrowth. And also, and this is maybe the point that I'll come to, and this gets back to your question. There are people who say that climate change is such an absolute disastrous emergency that we have got to deal with it immediately and first, and we have got to reduce carbon emissions by any means necessary to maintain the conditions for life on planet Earth. And I sort of believe that. Then there are other people who say, well, yes, climate change is a complete emergency, but we must not address it without solving problems of racism, colonialism, inequality, sexism, heteropatriarchy, and all these kinds of things at the same time, right? And both positions can't really be true in their extreme forms, because if something is an emergency, like the ambulance coming down the road, then every other vehicle gets out of the way. If something is not an emergency, then the ambulance gets in line, the climate ambulance gets in line behind the racism and classism ambulances. So I'm trying to find a middle position, which says that we need a large enough constituency to retire fossil fuels and replace them with renewables. The kind of carbon fundamentalists who believe that the priority must be to reduce carbon emissions are too few in number. There are actually too few people who wake up in the morning every day most worried about 420 parts per million or so. I may be a little bit behind in my number. Most people, even on the left, even environmentalists, don't wake up every day worrying first and foremost about that thing. And so those people need to make an alliance with the people who wake up every day in the morning worried about racism, colonialism, cis heteropatriarchy, and so on, right? And so so degrowth is, I think, a misleading approach, but some approach, which is what I've advocated, of a popular movement for renewables, which empower the broadest possible scope of society, I think may get us there, and get us there faster, which is the important thing, faster than other approaches, either capitalist or far left, to the energy transition.
Great. So I think let's then kind of bring this evening to a close. Let me ask you to kind of join me in thanking